Log number. What number is this again? 43. Log number 43. A while ago, I began simulated testing on an alternate version of dimension G3N5H1N. By rewriting some of the world's threads and replacing them in a copy, I could manipulate and observe any changes in a controlled setting. I usually kept the thread manipulation within the confines of the world's mechanics, things that would affect how we interact with this dimension or the entities within it. But there may have been one project in particular I was a little more invested in. Chroma Thread CC6A and CC6B, also known as Arashi and Kaito. About a year ago, I inserted them into the world as a means of exploring the electrocharge reaction, and I thought it would be fun to add some lore when creating their chroma threads. I swear, I was just indulging a little bit, but as it turns out, in the same way that adding new rules affects existing rules, apparently adding new lore affects existing lore. Who would have thought? In this world, the people of Inazuma started sharing the story of Arashi and Kaito, and after hearing this heartbreaking tale, many citizens held their loved ones closer than ever. Things within the timeline changed. Dynamics between people changed. People changed. Most of these anomalies in the lore are minimal, but one of them had a much bigger effect. In an effort to rescue the traveler from the Raiden Shogun, Kaedehara Kazuha unlocked the power within his friend's Electrovision. This allowed him to harness both Electro and Anemo. It only lasted a brief moment, and we would never see such an event from him again. At the end of the Inazuma arc, Kazuha leaves the vision behind at his friend's burial site. And I've always been interested in this plot point. More specifically, the alternate choice. What would happen if Kazuha kept his friend's vision? What if he was able to permanently unlock its power to dual-wield Anemo and Electro? There are so many possibilities on the lore end on where this could go in the story, but on the gameplay side, these would result in a Kazuha SP form, kind of like what they do with characters in HSR. This video is going to expand on that idea and explore what kind of kit Kazuha would have in this alternate timeline. As always, additional info is down below and captions are available if you need them. Without further ado, let's get started. Would you believe me if I told you that the design for Kazuha's Electro kit centers around this one scene? As you can see here, he manages to use his abilities to block the Musono Hitotachi, one of the Raiden Shogun's, if not most, powerful sword techniques of all. And a feat like that is not something we should be glossing over. What you can expect from this kit is something that mixes his current kit, but also adds some extra mechanics around defensive utility and counterattacking. This is also something that ties perfectly well with Kazuha's relationship to Beidou, as the two of them travel together on the Crux. Beidou's own kit utilizes mechanics centered around parries and counterattacking. From a lore perspective, you could argue that if Kazuha kept the Electrovision, Beidou would teach him her fighting techniques, which translates to similarities on the gameplay level. Let's look at the actual kit. The exact order I'm going to go in is really weird. I'm going to start off with Kazuha's Burst, since it sets the foundation for the rest of his kit. Upon casting, Kazuha enters the Lightning's Glow state for 18 seconds, dealing 3 instances of AoE Electro damage, followed by 1 instance of AoE Anemo damage. This will scale on his attack and EM. For a bit of context on how the damage scalings go, think of it similarly to Nahida or Alhaitham. The EM scaling is the main scaling, while the attack scaling is just there for artifact substat friendliness. As for the Lightning's Glow effect itself, when active party members deal damage, Kazuha will deal alternating coordinated attacks of Electro damage and Anemo damage to nearby opponents, based on his attack and EM. This can occur once every second. With how the alternating occurs, Electro and Anemo effectively occur once every 2 seconds. The Electro and Anemo hits also have no ICD, which also makes Kazuha's individual Electro and Anemo application a 2-second interval. This portion of the ability is inspired by Beto's burst, as she also deals coordinated electro damage when party members deal normal or charge attack hits. Onto the portion I mentioned earlier when it comes to defensive utility and counterplay. If the active character is hit while Kazuha is in the lightning's glow state, he will block the attack, mitigating its damage and all subsequent damage within a 1-second interval. The max amount of mitigation will scale on his EM. Afterwards, he'll deal a dual strike of electro and anemo damage, scaling with his attack and EM. After 2.5 seconds, Kazuha will be able to trigger the damage mitigation and counterattack again. The best comparison I can make for this mechanic on Kazuha would be a hybrid of Dea and Beto. Kazuha's blocking is not a shield, it's damage mitigation. Dea's main issue is that her mitigation is extremely weak, only providing around 50% mitigation for each hit. And in the end, that's not a lot of survivability. On the Beto end, it's a lot more straightforward. It can block a set amount of damage before unleashing a counterattack. Kazuha's basically an upgraded Beto in that regard. He would be able to block maybe around 5,000 or 6,000 damage for each instance, which is similar to Beto's. And then the counterattack is basically an automatic parry, and unlike Beto, who's locked behind a 7.5 second cooldown, Kazuha's is a 2.5 second cooldown. His strength with this ability is against enemies who have staggered but powerful strikes. Think of Magukenki as an example. It doesn't have these crazy fast attacks, and it even has a few charge-up attacks that deal high amounts of damage. Iframing is one of the best ways to avoid these attacks, but now you have Kazuha as a good alternative to tank the hits, and also deal extra damage as a result. On the flip side, his biggest weakness is in fights against sustained damage. The blocking mechanic is indiscriminate. It doesn't matter if he's hit with a dinky pebble or a giant meteor. His counterattack is triggered all the same, and he's put on cooldown all the same. A good boss example might be the Hera. During its charge-up period, it spawns a barrage of these energy blades that deal consistent hits of damage. Kazuha might be able to block 1 or 2 of these hits, but after the cooldown starts, you'd have to start iframing and dodging like normal. This idea is the same for damaging fields, such as the Seahorse's electro fields or the big Yumkasaur's pyro fields. All of these details to say, Kazuha can be a really good option for defensive utility, but this ability is very enemy reliant. If damage occurs too fast, you lose out on survivability. If damage happens too slowly, you're not really triggering the counterattack as much. That's why he still has his regular burst hits that are more reliable to trigger. These sustain his damage and application, and the counterattack is just there for extra instances and a bit of visual flair. Anyway, final notes. Just like his regular version, his burst cost is 60 with a 15-second cooldown. Next up, we're going to cover his A0 passive, since it also ties directly in with his burst. While Kazuha is in the lightning glow state, his elemental alignment will be temporarily converted to electro, and he will not be considered an anemo character. For anyone who watched my Unit 2.0 video on the Hearth Trio, this ability should look very familiar. My Lynette buff idea involved her being able to change her elemental type based on whatever element her burst absorbed. This allowed her to mask as any of the 4 Petch elements and sneak into teams that rely on units being that element. Kazuha's is basically the same thing, except he's guaranteed to switch to Electro no matter what. Considering the fact that Kazuha's burst duration is 18 seconds, he's mainly gonna be an Electro unit, but as we'll cover later on, he's an Electro unit who can provide certain anemo-centric perks. Next up is Kazuha's skill. For his tap skill, he dashes to a nearby opponent, dealing a single hit of anemo damage and creating a wind vortex that pulls enemies in. If the skill is held, Kazuha will dash to the enemy, dealing 5 hits of electro damage. Visually, the attack would look similar to this scene right here. As for application, the hold skill applies electro 3 times, on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th hit. Being able to choose your element with a tap or hold provides options in other forms of utility. If you use the Anemo tap skill, he can trigger Swirl to activate VV and group enemies together. Then for his hold skill, it's going to be more of a damage ability. There's higher multipliers, and it applies electro more, so it results in stronger quicken synergy. He spawns 5 particles regardless of tap or hold, but the element of the particles depends on whether he taps or holds the skill. The cooldown is still the same as his current cooldown, 6 seconds for tapping and 9 seconds for holding. In teams where Kazuha can afford to swap back in multiple times, the cooldown should allow him to refresh VV uptime. Being able to choose Anemo or Electro particles gives some flexibility if you funnel specific units. But what about Kazuha himself? If he's gonna be Electro most of the time, Anemo particles would surely be less effective, right? Well, that's where his A1 passive comes in. Regardless of whether Kazuha's elemental type is Anemo or Electro, he will gain the full amount of energy from Anemo and Electro particles, or orbs. This passive is unconditional, meaning Kazuha doesn't have to be in his burst state to get this effect. The way energy works is that you get different amounts based on whether you're on or off field, and whether the element matches that character. On field with the same element is 3 energy, off field with same element is 1.8, on field with different element is 1, and off field with a different element is 0.6. For Kazuha, Anemo and Electro will both be 3 or 1.8 energy, depending on field stance. This means it doesn't matter whether you use Kazuha's tap or hold in terms of personal energy, since it will generate the same amount. It also means his energy needs are slightly less restrictive since he has a second element that provides the same value. For Kazuha's A4, while the burst state is active, all party members have their elemental damage increased whenever Kazuha or the active character triggers an Electro or Anemo reaction. The bonus will apply to the elements involved, and is the same 0.4% increase for every point of EM Kazuha has. This lasts for 10 seconds, and each element has independent durations. This passive is basically Kazuha's current A4, but better. Since Kazuha applies Electro and Anemo pretty consistently, he should be able to maintain full uptime for these elemental bonuses. But unlike his other A4 passive, Anemo is actually included in the bonus when Swirl occurs. The inclusion of Electro reactions gives you a secondary avenue for the Petch stuff, but it also means Dendro and Geo join the party. With Dendro, it's pretty straightforward with Quicken and Hyper Bloom, and then for Geo, Kazuha himself can't trigger Electro Crystallize, but this upgraded ability includes Kazuha and the active character, meaning a Geo on-fielder can enable the Geo damage bonus. It's a lot more versatile on him as opposed to before. So versatile, in fact, that you might be able to get away with nerfing the bonus value, and he still might be a really strong option on a lot of teams. This alternate version of Kazuha's kit is designed around being just that, an alternate kit. This isn't like Unit 2.0 where I'm specifically reworking a character to fix their main problems. I was just looking at the idea of an Electro Kazuha, and what his gameplay could look like when we take into account game mechanics and lore. And overall, I think it's pretty fitting with what we know about the guy. We have a character who can use unique utility around being a dual elemental user, gave him an ability reminiscent of his Musono Hitotachi scene, and tied his lore with Beidou into the kit as well. The big thing I didn't add was a mechanic allowing him to dual identify as Electro and Anemo at the same time. This was mainly because of a possible issue where Kazuha could facilitate certain resonance mechanics and effectively count as 2 characters. For example, you could have something like Kazuha, Varka, Fischl, and Bennett. If Kazuha counted as both Anemo and Electro simultaneously, he would allow for Electro and Anemo resonance at the same time. He'd also allow Varka to fulfill his elemental requirements, while also allowing the 4th party member to be any element. It would be really cool to have this character mechanic, but I'm not ready to think about the balancing nightmare that would be. So for now, how about we explore the mechanic ahead of us later? Anyway, how does Electro Kazuha differ from our Kazuha? Well, for starters, we have a pretty solid option for a defensive Electro unit. Inefa is already a shielder, and Beidou at C1 has a shield, but Kazuha definitely makes his mark as a more generalized support. Kazuha also provides higher damage output compared to his old version, as well as having much more versatile buffing in his A4 passive. This Electro kit also gives him options for other builds. Higher damage means he can build 4 damage. Emblem can be one of his options since its main source would be burst damage. Alternatively, Gilded Dreams would probably be a stronger choice overall. This gives him a boost on his damage, but also his damage mitigation and damage bonus. It also might be more reliable to trigger, since Kazuha might not build that much ER for Emblem's bonus. For the artifact main stats, crit circlets can be considered for higher damage output. Then Electro or Anemo damage goblets are a viable option, but the Electro and Anemo multipliers will be the same. If you want a balance of elemental damage, you should stick to an EM goblet. This choice also once again means better overall utility. But the biggest perk to Kazuha is that despite being more of an Electro unit, he can still run a VV set. After all, the set doesn't require the unit to be an Anemo-aligned character, they just have to trigger Swirl, and Kazuha is still completely capable of doing just that. Lately, I know the VV set's been losing some viability because more and more Reshred units have been released, but the idea of him providing 40% shred while also identifying as an Electro character is going to create some pretty cool archetypes. Let's cover these archetypes right now. We'll cover the main types of teams, and then we're going to cover his unique synergies with a few select characters. In all of these teams, Kazuha provides great damage, defensive utility, and damage boosting. He serves as a really good hyper carry support in a lot of teams where you can slot an Electro character. Now, let's talk archetypes. The first one is Quicken and Hyper Bloom. Just like many of our Sumeru characters, Kazuha is a unit who has dual scaling on attack and EM, with EM being the main scaling. Kazuha applies Electro pretty frequently, which can trigger Quicken, Aggravate, and Hyper Bloom. His EM scaling can double dip for both his regular multipliers and his Aggravate bonus. On top of that, he deals Electro Swirls, which can chain trigger an Aggravated Swirl. Now, this isn't really new for him. When Dendro first released, Kazuha was already capable of absorbing Electro for Aggravate. That's why I think him having this alternate kit is much more effective when you look at him through Hyper Bloom. In his current form, Kazuha can work in Hyper Bloom teams, but there's a few caveats when it comes to making him an Electro trigger. One, he needs to properly absorb Electro in his burst, but this can be unreliable since Hydro is also present and it generally takes priority over Electro. Second, you still have to bring an Electro unit to apply the element for Kazuha to absorb, but with his alternate form, Kazuha deals unconditional Electro damage, and this allows him to work as a solo Electro unit, giving you an option to go double Hydro or Dendro. The next archetype will be the Electrocharged Umbrella, which includes EC, but also Lunar Charged and Overvape. These are teams focused on personal damage as opposed to the reactions. Because Electrocharge can be double swirled by Anemo, uptime on Electro, Hydro, and Anemo damage bonuses should all be fairly consistent in these teams. Any general on-fielder can work really well with Kazuha, so long as they scale on regular damage bonuses. Now, let's get this out of the way. Lunar Charged isn't really going to be a good synergy for Kazuha, because he buffs damage percent, which isn't really used in LC damage. Kazuha can only buff the non-lunar characters. The next variant is Overvape. Similar to the idea of Anemo being able to double swirl an EC aura, Pyro can dual vaporize and Overload. Overload can trigger the Pyro damage bonus from Kazuha's A4, but this has a slight downside. You're not really going to have Kazuha trigger Overload, so you need to rely on the Pyro unit triggering it for consistent uptime, but this bonus only activates when it's Kazuha or the active character. In Pyro on-fielding teams like Arlecchino, this is a non-issue. If your Pyro unit is an off-fielder, they can't refresh the Pyro bonus in their duration. Xiangling can't refresh this, but she snapshots, so she can still use the bonus for her full duration. The reason I say this is a slight downside is because the main person to lose out on this bonus is Durin. He can trigger Overvape on-field when setting up his rotation, but after that he can't refresh the bonus, and unlike Xiangling, he doesn't snapshot. But uptime isn't the worst. 10 seconds in an 18 to 20 second rotation is still roughly 50% uptime. These previous sections showed Kazuha's potential as a support for general Electro teams, but now let's look at how he shines as an Electro identifying support. While Kazuha is still a generally good support for Overload, Chevret's Overload becomes even more powerful. You can swirl Pyro or Electro to provide 40% VV shred, but on top of that, Kazuha will align himself as an Electro character for most, if not the entirety, of a rotation. This can activate Chevre's A1 passive, which also provides 40% Pyro and Electro Shred. For a while, you can shred up to 80%, but it's slightly balanced out by the fact that VV uptime won't last for the entire rotation, unless you swap back in to refresh it. Kazuha can solve himself with other Electro supports, but can also be a flexible alternative in just as many situations. His defensive utility is also a really unique selling point, since the best Electro options for Overload don't really have that. Next character is Chaska. Her Petch bullets are much stronger than her Animo ones, and enabling these bullets requires characters who are part of the Petch roster. Kazuha would count as an Electro character, and provides an Electro bullet for Chaska to fire. Some teams have Chaska running VV instead of Obsidian Codex, but if Kazuha is able to run VV instead, Chaska can once again invest more into her personal damage. On a slightly similar boat, Kazuha with Shilonen would be a really interesting support duo. A few teams already like to run these two together because they can stack upwards of 80% damage bonus and around 75% res shred. What makes the Electro version much more interesting is that Kazuha will now identify as an Electro character, meaning he can contribute to Shilonen's minimum of 2 Petch units for her skill's res shred. For example, you can run a Sino Kazuha Shilonen core with a Dendroflex for Quicken, and you can still have the full damage bonus and res shred combo from the two supports. The important thing is that Kazuha needs to go before Shilonen in a rotation, so that he can switch over from Animo to Electro. Another great synergy is Neuvillette. Neuvillette doesn't get his Draconic stacks from characters being different elements, but rather triggering different Hydro reactions. Kazuha alone can contribute up to 2 reactions with Electrocharge and Hydro Swirl. This frees up room to run a Hydro character, such as Furina, and still be able to achieve max stacks with a 3-element team. And last, but certainly not least, Varka. Varka's in a position where his best archetype is Pyro, but he still has this potential to grow and get better as other units get released. With Kazuha, he's elevating the Electro branch for Varka teams. As of right now, Varka's Electro options are pretty limited. With Kazuha, he functions very well as a generalist support for Varka. He provides Animo and Electro damage bonuses for the team to use, and can once again be a useful unit for VV. Let's say I have a team of Varka, Venti, and Kazuha. Depending on which off-fielder dishes out higher damage, Venti and Kazuha have options to run a stat buffing set when the other runs VV. If it's Kazuha running VV, Venti has the Hexerite damage set. And if it's Venti, then Kazuha has access to Gilded. Do I think that Electro Kazuha will make Electro Varka teams as strong as Pyro? Probably not, but it's a step in that direction. Looking at the broader scope of what Kazuha brings with an Electro kit, he's this overall general support that mainly works in Electro teams, but his unique ability to become an Electro character makes him even more interesting for a few select teams that require party members to identify as Electro. We'll have plenty more opportunities to explore this idea. Maybe I'll look at Geo characters who can do the same thing. Maybe I'll look at some more unrealistic combinations like Pyro and Hydro, or Dendro and Cryo. And since I didn't cover this idea with Kazuha, maybe I'll explore the idea of a unit that can dual enable elemental mechanics. But for now, that'll do it for the video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on this Electro Kazuha concept, what you liked, what you might change, and any alternative ideas you might have. If you want to share more ideas with our community, consider joining my Discord server. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye! Log number 43B. After careful observation, the Kazuha anomaly doesn't seem to have any lasting effects, but a new idea came to mind. Previously, altering any entity's elemental alignments were considered as unstable. This recent discovery, however, showed me how to do just that. I'd have to set up a controlled environment before jumping into this, but give it some time. I think I can make this work. System, create new simulation branch. Codename, Elementals.